How individuals learn, improve, and perform voluntary movements is motor learning. An example of this is learning to shoot a basketball. I will teach this complex skill by first explaining the importance of understanding motor learning. Then, I will talk about the different stages a learner goes through using the Fitz and Posner's stages of learning and Bernstein's models of degrees of freedom. Then, I will talk about how different joints can be frozen and released to help with the learning to shoot a basketball. Finally, I will focus on the importance of motivation and reinforcement when learning a new skill. Motor learning is a permanent change in the execution of a motor skill due to practice or experience. During motor learning, learners go through different stages. There are different models which have different stages. According to Fitz and Posner model, learners go through stages which improve the smoothness and accuracy of movements. The first stage of this model is the cognitive stage. This is where the learner is gathering information. This stage also has the most errors. The next stage is the associative stage. This is where actions are being put together. There will be small gains and and some conscious effort. The final stage is the autonomous stage, where there's a lot of time and practice and movements become automatic and smooth. According to Bernstein's model, which also has 3 stages, there are degrees of freedom which are needed to complete an action. The degrees of freedom are independent movements, which is the main element of learning a new motor skill. The first stage is the initial stage where movements are simplified by freezing the degrees of freedom. The next stage is the advanced stage, where more degrees of freedom are added, along with more movement which is needed for the task. Finally, the last stage is the expert stage, where all degrees of freedom are processed to carry out the task effectively. Motor tasks such as shooting a basketball require a variety of movements. The central nervous system can face a problem due to the processing of all these movements. By restricting the range of motion of joints and putting different joint movements together, the motor skill will be easier to perform. This is known as freezing the degrees of freedom. Freezing should be done in the early stages and will decrease in later stages. This aligns with Fitz and Posner's model, which said the early learning stages require high cognitive activity and will decrease as the learning develops. Here we begin with the learner starting to freeze the degrees of freedom. The lower body will be frozen, and we will only focus on the upper body movements. The focus is on the shooting arm, with the learner finding the comfortable shooting pocket. As you can see, he is practicing this over and over until he feels comfortable and confident. Here, the learner still has the lower body frozen. He should be focusing now on the shooting arm, pushing the ball up fully by extending the arm and flicking the wrist at the end to reach into a cookie jar on the top shelf. Here is an example of an incorrect movement. The learner is not flicking his wrist and reaching into the cookie jar. Here again, the learner is practicing pushing the ball up fully by extending his arm and flicking the wrist at the end to reach into the cookie jar on the top shelf. But this time, he's flicking his wrist, but he's not fully extending his arm. The learner is not able to move on until this movement has become comfortable and almost automatic. This learner is showing the correct example of how this movement should work. She is pushing the ball up by fully extending her arm and flicking her wrist at the end to reach into the cookie jar on the top shelf. Her lower body is also frozen during the whole movement. Here, the learner is adding another degree of freedom. He is adding his guide hand to the movement. The problem with his movement is that he has forgotten that his lower body should still be frozen. Also, he has not fully extended his arm like we had practiced before. Perhaps this learner ready to add more degrees of freedom to be unfrozen. This learner was ready to add another degree of freedom to the movement. Her lower body is still frozen. First, she begins by finding her shooting pocket, pushing the ball up by fully extending her arm and flicking her wrist at the end to reach into the cookie jar on the top shelf. Also, she has correctly added the guide hand to the movement. Now that the learner is confident with her upper body movements, she is able to unfreeze her lower body. She is going to bend her knees, find the shooting pocket, use her guide hand, push the ball up by extending her arm fully, flick the wrist, and reach into the cookie jar. A challenge that a learner may face when learning a new skill is motivation. As a skill becomes more advanced, more failures are bound to happen. Motivation is directly related to initiation, maintenance, and intensity of behavior. A great method for influencing motivation is through goal setting. A great way to set goals is using the SMART criteria. These goals should be specific, measurable, assignable, realistic, and time-related. Along with motivation is the use of reinforcement. Reinforcement is an event, action, or phenomenon which increases the chances of a response happening again. This could be a positive reinforcement, which could be a verbal praise or a special reward given. Negative reinforcement, on the other hand, would be taking away that praise or reward from the coach. Punishment, on the other hand, is an event, action, or phenomenon which decreases the chance of a response happening again. This is different than negative reinforcement, as it's used to eliminate a response. An example of a punishment would be running line drills for every shot missed during basketball practice. Reinforcers in punishment can be tangible, which is a trophy or candy, or intangible, which can be verbal praise or verbal scolding. The most important thing to remember when learning a new skill is practice, practice, practice.